I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. And today I have a special guest. She is the author of several books and, of course, a poetry. And in celebration for Poetry Month this coming April, well, my guest, no other than Miss Sapha Burnell.
Hello, everybody. How are you doing this fine, albeit slightly groggy day? I hope everyone's having a fantastic weekend, and I hope you are ready to enjoy some amazing talk about poetry. I am the cyberpunk and mythpunk-based author of Usurper Kings, which is my poetry collection. I've also got Neon Leben, my cyberpunk novel, Charnash and Son of Abel, books 1 and 2 of the Judge of Mystic saga, and Macabre and Monstrous. There are, of course, other short stories and things on the way. Short stories have been published last year and a few years before, but those are my main ones, and it feels great to go back to poetry today because that's the first thing I ever published, and I'm so proud of it. So,
Yes, poetry, people. So, Miss Burnell, what inspires you to write a poetry?
I think my inspiration to go with poetry was based on a couple of things. One, I grew up listening to epic poems. You know, my grandfather was a big lover of epic poetry, so I was this little kid sitting on his knee listening to him speak Beowulf in the Old Norse, because of course, he's Norwegian. And so he was trying to keep it alive. He was like, I'm going to keep this alive if I have to repeat this to a 7-year-old. But I loved it. That kind of beat your shield, rhythmic, epic poem about a very brutal but very honorable man. Beowulf is the hero, but he's also this force of nature until the end. I wouldn't say spoilers on something that's more than 1,000 years old. So, Beowulf does end up being an old man dying because he fights a dragon in the end. But he defeats the dragon, and passes things on. And it's just, those stories gripped me. The Iliad gripped me. Virgil's Aeneid gripped me. All of these things really held me firm. Keats, going into more modern poetry too, with Margaret Atwood and Christopher Levinson. And I fell in love with poetry. And while I was in university, I happened to have some excellent professors who also loved poetry, including one, just an incredible professor. She really instilled down how to condense a really big idea into something that can be disseminated through poetry, and taught of the heteroglossic nature of poetry, that you can have all of these different layers, all of these massive amounts of meanings that you can break down from very few and sometimes very simple words. If people understand the context, then it's like, boom, your world explodes in a good way, not in the apocalyptic way. But
Yes.
sometimes poetry makes you feel that way, though.
Yes, especially if you internalize it. So, Miss Burnell, how do you overcome writer's block when crafting a poem?
I go back to the themes and the subject of the poem itself. And I think, what textures, what images, what sensations am I trying to get across? So usually a poem for me is a search for meaning. It is about something. And I know that is the case for a lot of poets. There is some poetry that's been coming out, in recent times, which is not necessarily a search for meaning, but is its own form of psychoanalysis, or its sort of grip on self-love and different things. And, you do get the poems like William Carlos Williams' Red Wheelbarrow, where it's just about a wheelbarrow beside some chickens. And that's totally fine. That sort of modern push is totally fine.
Mm.
But for me personally, it's a search for meaning. And so I stop what I'm doing. I take a step back and I go, all 5 senses. What are they? What does this mean? When I'm writing a poem about, say, an orange, then what is it? As somebody who loves food and things like that, what is an orange? And you can like hold it in your hand and it's a little bit rough on the skin, and you can kind of like break the skin a little, and all of a sudden the oils from the orange peel and the smell will just start like wafting around, that beautiful citrus scent. And then what does that citrus scent make you think of? And the sunshine that's necessary to grow it. Maybe it reminds me of the oranges that we would eat all the time when I was doing work in West Africa, where they're green. They're not orange. They're green, going into a little bit of like yellow and things like that. And they're mottled and they almost look like they're unripe. But when you break them open, they're just beautiful. So like I try and go back to those images I'm trying to represent and what they mean. But I'm trying to think of, okay, what does it smell like? What does it sound like when you pull the peel off? What does it sound like when you separate out all of those sections of an orange? What does it taste like? What does it represent? And how can you get people in on that very visceral experience in a way that you're not necessarily going to have the chance to with prose?
Yes. So, Miss Burnell, do you agree that there's no writer's block if you inspired of what you're doing?
I think when it comes to writer's block, I think there are a couple of things. If you are a writer who is intending to be a writer professionally, then there is a certain amount of discipline that needs to come into your work. And this is not always going to be a fix-all for everything, but when you're training yourself over a period of time, taking months and months to train yourself and then years to train yourself to write every day, to get back into that mindset, to find your way back into that mindset, then writer's block is a little bit more elusive of a neighbor. It's still going to knock on your door once in a while, but it's not going to have nearly the amount of times in a week where it keeps knocking for a cup of sugar or, hey, do you want to go for coffee? I think too, for me personally, I have multiple projects. So when I kind of stall out on one project, I flip gears to another one of my projects. This is why I have 2 novel series that I'm working on right now, the Lieben Cycle and the Judge of Mystic Saga. And I'll flip gears and then work out something there. And then once I've been like, okay, I worked something out, I accomplished something, let's go back and tackle that thing that kind of scared me or that stopped me from, finishing it for some reason. And so one hand discipline, because this is an art, but it's also the craft of writing. And you can improve how you conduct yourself in a craft. Just with art, you could spend more time to learn how to do proper brushstrokes. This is especially important in something like rosmaling, which is a Norse folk art that I do. And I started out by just painting giant C's and giant S's on the page. 4 hours. Because grandfather was like, no, you got to get your strokes down. I'm like, oh.
Perfectly.
But you can build that part of yourself so that when those moments of indecision come, you're able to kind of, 1, you could try and motor through. And 2, if that doesn't work, then you can take that step back, get yourself a cup of tea or coffee or whatever beverage that you prefer, and look at what you're doing. Why are you stopping yourself from continuing forward? Is it because this is uncomfortable for you? Is it because this is a scene that's fairly difficult? Is it because of indecision? You don't know where the scene is going to go? Do you need to go back and outline it? Do you need to go back and see what is needed? Do you need to go back and read something that you wrote before to connect those dots like pearls on a necklace? Is it a lot of the time what I see when I am mentoring authors is that their writer's block moments are actually moments of personal discomfort that they're not willing to necessarily share. And I don't want them to share anything that's too personal, so that's totally fine. But once they understand, oh, I don't want to write this scene because it reminds me of something that happened 2 years ago. And I didn't realize that was still bothering me. And somehow subconsciously, I wrote it into my book. Great. Do you need this scene? Can we remove it? Can you move on to something else? No, I'm going to write it. Okay. Sit down, knuckle down, put on whatever music or whatever silence that helps you. If you're somebody that usually listens to music while you work, try turning the music off and work in silence.
Yes.
If you're somebody who works with silence, try finding a piece of music, usually instrumental. Because I find that if you start adding a whole bunch of words to the music, although I do, my playlists are full of music with actual lyrics in them. But if you're struggling with the scene and then you put something on with lyrics, a lot of the time, some of those lyrics will kind of bleed through. So find something instrumental. Take a minute and then get back on that horse.
Oh, yes, definitely. Do you follow specific poetic forms or do you prefer free verse, and why?
Again, this is going to be one of those circumstances where you're going to be like, Sapha. I do both. I actually have both. In Usurper Kings, which is my poetry collection that was published in 2014. So its 10th anniversary edition is live right now in paperback, digital, and hardcover. And it's a beautiful, Kevin Hogan said it was a work of jaw-droppingly beautiful discovery. So that made me very, very excited about that. I have sonnets, both sort of Shakespearean sonnets and other forms of sonnet. I have epic poems in a skaldic style. I have poetry that corresponds with different meters and different structures from history. And then I also have free verse as well. So I find for me, again, this is another thing, maybe it was because I was trained by people who stood on the bedrock of people that came before. And because of my love for the classics, in order to free verse, I have to know what the structure used to be. It's sort of that idea from T.S. Eliot of, you can be a futurist once you know what happened in the past.
Yes.
But how can you be a futurist if you don't know what foundation you're standing on? How do you subvert what you don't know? And so I love researching into ancient poetry, everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh to about 50 years after Shakespeare. Those are my jam. I absolutely love kind of getting into those sorts of poetry, especially skaldic poetry. And skaldic poetry has a lot more alliterative rules and also just different conventions that are totally mind-breaking in the English language. It's like, this works better in Norse and Germanic languages, which English kind of is, but English is the language that sort of stole everybody else's lunch money and then put it all together and bought yogurt. And by researching all of those old forms and kind of experimenting with those, it reminds me of playing piano and those endless scales and arpeggios that all of us, piano students had to learn, all of the Hanon, where you're, the J.S. Bach, well-tempered clavier, doing all of that. And then eventually, once you've gotten those in your mind and your fingers and your muscles, once they are part of you, then you can start doing some jazz. You can figure out where that dissonant chord is and how to progress from that dissonance into something else, into something sweeter. And then that melody, that standard melody that you've been kind of enraptured with for so long, it's got a little bit of suspicion. It's got a little bit of, sustained drama. It's got that discord in it. It's got that subversion. And then in the end, usually it rectifies itself once again. And so I'm a very, very big proponent of the idea that if you want to do free verse in poetry, absolutely go for it. You need to know where poetry started, though.
Yes,
it
go
will
for
enrich
it.
your work.
Yes, people.
When you do.
Yes, go for it, people. So, Miss Burnell, how does your personal background influence your poetry?
I think more than any other form of written word, poetry is very personal. And it's more almost overtly personal, because a lot of people write poems about themselves
Yes.
or about emotion or about something that's happened in their lives. And yes, people write memoir and people write, biographies and things like that. But when it comes to poetry, we are tapping into the spirit, the emotion of a person. We are tapping into the subconscious and the creativity that just sort of meshes from the well within. And so it is almost, I would say almost, because there's always going to be people who are like, actually, this one wasn't, but almost always personal. Like, I think of the poetry collection Dearly by Margaret Atwood, which has a lot of poems. As it says on the back, even these are the late poems. Most poems are late, of course, too late, like a letter sent by a sailor that arrives after he's drowned. This was something released after her partner's death. And it feels like grieving, but it also feels like the catharsis you get from a good cry. It is that moment in time that you're able to kind of tackle some of these emotions and some of these things that are so big. A lot of us spend our entire lives trying to tackle them. And then it brings them to a place where we can actually attach for a moment and then close that off and put it away. And so I believe that poetry is both personal for the writer, it's personal for the poet, but it also creates a window, into the reader's own personal ideals and griefs and joys and exhilarations and boredoms and everything else, and gives the reader the chance. It frees the reader to feel things in a much different and more visceral way. It's almost like poetry gives them permission to be personal for a few minutes. At least good poetry for me does.
Yes, indeed. Very well said, Miss Sapha. But before we go on, I want to shout out my ranking tops in the last 30 days, because in Pakistan, I got number 8 on the Apple chart, Bhutan at number 10, United Arab Emirates at 16, Taiwan at 42, Jamaica 56, Cameroon at 76, Thailand at 97, and a lot more. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Miss Sapha Burnell. So, Miss Burnell, who are your favorite poets and how they are influence your writing?
So we talked a little earlier about Beowulf. We talked a little earlier just a bit about Virgil and Homer. I think my favorite poets that have been alive in the last few hundred years, definitely Margaret Atwood. I love her poetry. And that was actually my introduction into the work of Margaret Atwood. It was through her poetry in, I believe, a English 11 class. So, long-standing there. I also absolutely love the work of Christopher Levinson.
Yes.
Christopher Levinson is a Vancouver-based author who was born in Europe and had an incredible, incredible life. And the last one that I have here that's actually signed by Christopher Levinson is A Tattered Coat Upon a Stick. And he is very passionately visceral. And I love that. And it gets a little political in some places, but his voice is so strong and so clear. It just radiates outward in a very powerful way. And I love that. So definitely Christopher Levinson, absolutely go find some of his Pick Them Up. Another one that I actually quite enjoyed was George McWhirter. This is The Incorrection. And so George McWhirter was the Vancouver Poet Laureate for us for an amount of time. And I love... I was at the, oh my goodness, one of the Vancouver Literary Festivals, and he was there, and, we were talking poetry and things like that. And he signed this, and it was hilarious because he was like, oh yes. So The Incorrection, pardon me, my dear, I just have to correct something. And he went through his book and he found something incorrect in the incorrection. And he
Wow.
edited it right then and there. He's like, nope, this is happening. I was like, okay, that's great. I love that. He was a lot of fun. Sherry D. Wilson is also a fantastically emotional and emotive poet. And so I've got an example of her work right here with the Book of Sensations. I really like how she kind of twists the everyday and the mythical in the Book of Sensations. That really does it for me. I love that. So this was a fantastic book. Just for sheer story value when it comes to poetry. I love Emily Ursuliak, Throwing the Diamond Hitch. This is it's a little different than everything else because it's basically a story of her family member back in the day who basically rode through British Columbia with her friend on a horse.
Wow.
And so it's a little bit more rip-roaring, it's a little bit kind of cowboy, but just these two ladies going, I don't care if it's, what is it, the 1950s or the 1940s? We're going to ride from, up north to Vancouver on a horse. Okay, all right, go, you do you. Now this one I love because of his translation work. And this is, you can see by the dog-eared nature of this book, how much I've gone through it. This is Seamus Heaney's Beowulf. Seamus Heaney did an excellent job, in my opinion, translating Beowulf. And I love this edition too, because as with all translations of poetry, I love it when the original language is on one side and the translation is on the other. That is what I prefer. I see that too with the work of Hermann Hesse, the German, not the 1940s guy. There's a poet from Germany who wrote Siddhartha, which is an incredible novel to read, and also wrote poetry, predating the whole thing. Just, I have to say, just because the last name is similar, it doesn't mean that there's a connection. But I love reading translations of good poetry, and I love having the original language on the other side. And of course, I say original language. Now, we know Beowulf was an oral poem. It was an oral tradition before it was ever written down. And it was written down by people who were celebrating Christianity, shall we say. And so they were looking at certain things through a very specific lens. But it remains one of the best works of poetry in the world. And Seamus Heaney did, in my opinion, the best job of bringing it to life for modern English readers. I absolutely love it. I have incredible amounts of notes that are in this thing. I have written papers on this for years. I love it. So I would say that those are a few of my favorites. A couple more modern guys that are publishing poetry right now. Peter Graup Vestergaard of Warning Light Calling. He does fantastic work. He's a Danish poet. He writes in Danish and in English. And he wrote Danish Nordvest and Warning Light Calling. And Danish Nordvest is actually in a dialect of Danish that is dying. And so I love what he's doing to kind of keep that dialect alive. And also Dr. Brad Hogue. And Dr. Brad Hogue, his most recent work was The Drake Equation, and it's science fiction and aliens
Just
and
like Neon
natural
Living.
phenomenon. Yeah. And poetry. It's wonderful. So The Drake Equation and Warning Light Calling are definitely two of my current favorites. So shout out to them.
Yes, well said, Miss Burnell. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Movie 101 Review, and on my fourth season too. Please do listen to my latest episode. I interviewed one of the executive producer of Hope Studios because they are producing one of a kind movie called The Hopeful by Kyle Portbury, award-winning or Emmy Award winning director. So please do listen. Movie 101 on my fourth season too. So Miss Burnell, what themes do you find yourself returning to in your poetry?
I I love returning to, I mean, this is going to be no surprise. You and I have talked enough to know that I'm probably going to say this. I love returning to old myths. So myths from kind of the beginning of them, and then taking another look and taking another look and kind of putting on more modern and more modern and more modern lenses on those different stories. So in Usurper Kings, there's a couple of poems. One of them is Le Diadème du Ciel, La Reine du Ciel, so basically the crown of the Queen of Heaven. And then another one is Minerva, Athena. And those two poems were basically looks at the figures of Hera and Athena from an outside perspective, looking at the idea of this goddess named Hera right as Christianity was taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And with Athena, with the Minerva poem, it was how views of her have changed, going all the way from potential proto-Athena, as we're seeing in certain snake goddesses, taken from the Minoan soil, all the way through. And then what do you do with this figure? What do you do with this character? What does it mean to womanhood, and what does it mean to the past when you have, Zeus's quote unquote kind of like most lauded daughter, his favorite child, who was born out of his own head, but happens to be a female, but she's a female that maintains her virginity. Oh. So, she separated herself from that sensual play that you get with a figure like Hera, who's protecting married women. And just like getting into the way that those stories have changed. I love that. I love looking like Usurper King starts off with a mindset, almost like the hunter-gatherer mindset. Like it starts off with a few creation poems, and then it goes into that sort of ancient hunter-gatherer, sort of the start of civilization poems, and then goes kind of up and up and up and up to the future by the end of the collection. And being able to look at the same concept, human connection, work, looking at the concept of, food and the future, how we're going to keep our past alive when, everything's uploaded to some form of computational cloud, being able to look at how all of these concepts that form humanity so closely survive. They do. They survive. There are so many links, and you look at poetry going way back, you're like, oh yeah, here we go. There are so many themes that still maintain their presence for thousands of years. Well, how does that happen? What is it something within us? Is it something intrinsic to the human being? Is it something intrinsic to our creative subconscious? Is it just something that's part of our DNA? Or is it something that we only consider that way because of certain cultural standards? I love living inside that space and taking a look at what we now, as modern, postmodern people, can preserve from the past, but also can look at realistically from what we know now and kind of, okay, maybe they said that Zeus had thunderbolts because they didn't know how to explain the weather, maybe, maybe they had to say that there was a god underneath the mountain because they didn't know how to explain an earthquake.
Yes.
Or maybe the goddess of love is necessary because we all love. Yes. And we need somebody to blame for it.
That's the nature of people, to blame others. So, Ms. Burnell, how do you approach editing and revising your poem?
Number one, I read it aloud. I absolutely read it out loud. which at times when you're working in a public place like a coffee shop or a library can be a little bit odd. Just shout out to those people that work in wonderful public libraries that we have here in Canada, or say a coffee shop and all of a sudden you start a rousing rendition of Beowulf, people will start looking at you funny. Just say it's for a project. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
That's fine.
The first thing I do, I read it aloud. I see if it has flow. I see if it has a rhythm. Even if this is not meant to be read aloud and it's meant to just live on the page, it still has to flow in people's minds. And more than prose, poetry has to be like water going down a riverbank with a bunch of pebbles of varying size. So you've got to get that flow and the gurgle and everything else that you've got going on, those waves of motion. You've got to have that motion. Number two, after I look at the flow and see, does the rhythm work? Do I need to change some words here and there? Do I need to kind of restructure something? I look at figures of speech. I look at imagery and symbol. Are my symbols strong? Are they as strong as they could be? Is this just a stepping stone to a different symbol that would work better? Another thing I look at too is the tone, like the mood of the poem. Is this something that is meant to sadden someone, to bring them into a cathartic place? Or is it something meant to give them joy? Do I feel joyful reading this poem? Do I feel anything, or is this the seventh time I've gone through it and I'm numb? In which case, I put the poem away for 2 weeks. I don't look at it. I don't think about it. And then I come back to it after a couple of weeks with fresher eyes. And sometimes that's necessary, with any poetry or manuscript at all. If you're in the revision stages, put it down. Let it go for a couple of weeks and then look at it again later. Another thing I like to do is I like to kind of, okay, I'll be honest, read it to anybody in my life who will listen, which is astoundingly less people than other kinds of literature. It's poetry. It's not everyone's thing. But I try and think of who my target audience is. And with poetry, you can be more experimental. You can be more cerebral. That's kind of the area poetry lives in for a lot of people. Yes, you can have poetry about simple things. There's no saying you can't. But the people who tend to purchase poetry, the people who tend to read a lot of it, usually are people who want to get into something a little bit more experimental, a little bit more risky, a little bit more cerebral in nature. They want to unpack something. So you can kind of gauge, is this too surface level? Have I gone deep enough? Things like that. Read it to somebody. Read it to somebody who, is just sitting on the couch beside you, like my poor spouse, listening to all of my poems, and very educated person, PhD, the whole thing, and then every once in a while, it's like, yeah, so I understood half of that. Oh, okay. So maybe I need to pull back a little on certain things. Maybe I need to change a few words. What was confusing? Like, let's go through this. Okay. Well, what does this mean? Oh yeah, that's a word from the 1700s I put in. He's like, no, no, no. I'm like, okay, I'll take out the word from the 1700s and I'll put in its English common language equivalent, read it to somebody, see what they think, and don't be offended if they get something completely different, or if they don't get it, or, that kind of thing, because poetry kind of skims the line of cerebral and discoverable and completely out of luck. It can be discoverable. People can find a way in. There have to be contextual clues in the poem itself in order to guide people toward a meaning that you want them to have, unless you just want them to choose their own meaning and then, throw spaghetti at the wall. It can become impenetrable if too many of your sort of contextual cues are too niche and too abrupt, Or, well, obviously I was making an allusion to the 16th century poet, blah, blah, blah. And then, I put in a little bit of Anne Bradstreet. And, clearly, if you've read the classics, if you've read these following 17 books, then you'll understand this poem. Well, that is going to have a niche audience of probably less than 10 people. You sure about that?
Yes.
You're going to put that in a newsletter for those 10 people? Because then it'll be awesome. But you sure about that?
Sure. For sure, Miss Burnell.
I talked to myself here, too, because I had to do that quite a bit. I was like, okay, maybe I should edit that a little bit. Oh.
And that's a great inspiration when you're writing poetry. So at the end, Miss Burnell, can we read some of your favorite poems? But before that, I want to please people, please download one of my audiobooks, people. One of the bestsellers audiobook available on Audible. Of course, your book 101 Review Volume 3 Suggestions. Earth Fever, my climate change book, Unraveling Climate, and Our Race to Restore Balance. Of course, my book 101 Review Volume 2 Selected. And book 101 Review Volume 1, highly recommended. This is all my first season episodes, people. Book Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. And of course, my self-help book, Threads of Existence, Weaving Up, and Life is Too Short, a journey of discovery, fulfillment, and joy. Available on Audible, people. And please do download them and listen and enjoy. So, Miss Burnell, can we have the reading of your favorite poetry?
Oh, all right. From mine or from somebody else's?
It's up to you.
Okay, first thing I'm going to do is start with a small portion of Beowulf.
Yes.
I love it here. So again, blah, 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 blah. For those of you who are listening and can see us, then I just waggle the book in your face. For those of you who cannot see us, I just waggle the book in your face. So this is from Seamus Heaney's Beowulf. And it is a part of the book where Hrothgar, the Thane, the ruler of the Danes, where they are, who has been losing warriors to Grendel, the monster. Grendel, for so long. Finally, Beowulf comes and he's like, I am here to solve your problems. I will defeat Grendel. I will take this monster away from you so you can survive. All of this is going on. There has been a little minor hubbub where one guy who's really jealous is all like, you're not that great. And everyone else around him is like, dude, do you know who that is? It's fucking Beowulf. Pardon my French. Literally Beowulf, later on in the poetry work, Beowulf rips Grendel's arm off and beats the monster to death with his own arm.
Oh my God.
So Beowulf is metal. It's incredible. Beowulf is this raw, powerful warrior who understands that as a raw, powerful warrior, he has this power that is uncontainable in a way, and he can be aggressive. He can go to places that are almost monstrous. But he also has the honor and chivalry is a bit of a later concept, but he also has the honor and the courage and the tenderness of being within a society where everybody needs to take care of each other. So it's this interplay between the warrior, who is this vicious, incredible strongman, and this man who's looking at an aging king who's lost too many warriors. And I just love how human it is. O flower of warriors, beware that trap. Choose, dear Beowulf, the better part, eternal reward. Do not give way to pride. For a brief while your strength is in bloom, but it fades quickly. And soon there will follow illness or the sword to lay you low, or a sudden fire or surge of water, or jabbing blade, or javelin from the air, or repellent age. Your piercing eye will dim and darken, and death will arrive, dear warrior, to sweep you away. Just so I ruled the Ring Danes' country for 50 years, defended them in wartime with spear and sword against constant assaults by many tribes. I came to believe my enemies had faded from the face of the earth. Still, what happened was a hard reversal from bliss to grief. Grendel struck after lying in wait. He laid waste to the land, and from that moment my mind was in dread of his depredations. So I praise God in his heavenly glory that I lived to behold this head-dripping blood, and that after such harrowing I can look upon it in triumph at last. Take your place then, with pride and pleasure, and move to the feast. Tomorrow morning our treasure will be shared and showered upon you. I just, this is Beowulf after he has slain Grendel. You know, this is Beowulf who's at his most powerful, and he has this man being like, okay, huh, yeah, you know, grab yourself a drink. Like, obviously we're going to party. It's going to be okay. Like, we're going to have fun, but don't be a prideful idiot. You have this power now. You will not always have this power. You have to live your life knowing that you will not always be as strong as you were in your 20s. You know, I love that. It's so human. And it's something that was thousands of years old. And yet it's so human. I love it. Like, oh, we can't forget that. I've got a short one from my poetry collection, L'Hymne Électrique. So this is a poem that is, you know, a little more than halfway through the collection. And here we go. How is celluloid different from digital? Movement of light and fluctuant waves, dancing comme les ballerins pour le roi. Le chanson, ma petite le chanson. Collective of noise, pleasant or dystopic, plays the vibration like a djembe in Accra's autumn. Resonations, the latest phase for hipsters seeking nuance in old theater seats dusted with popcorn. Play on, the song, my sweet, in electric infamy, play on. Embroil the hip and the wave functions. In a battle no stopwatch can measure, lest it come from Grandpa's day, wound a click a minute in musical timidity and repeated performances, identical through celluloid or digital FLAC track for all ages. I miss the crackle of the gramophone, but I dig this sound. And so this one, for me, was more of, I was in the middle of doing some recording in a studio for some different musical projects and things. And we were kind of debating between like making a record and MP3s, which are sort of like the JPEGs of the audio world. You know, they kind of compress sound. You lose a lot of those tones and that richness. Meanwhile, you could have like a digital FLAC track, which is a little bit closer to the way that it would have been if you'd had analog sound. But how is it the same and how is it different? And what do we do with it now? Like, people aren't sitting around an old-timey radio waiting for their show to come on. They're not necessarily, like, I have a record player, but, you know, they're not necessarily listening to their music through a record player where you actually have to take time and care and precision as you put it down. And then you need to make sure that your needle is okay. And you need to kind of make everything work and watch out whether or not it skips. And it's this more visceral experience than just clicking play on the beloved Spotify. No shade on Spotify. I listen to it a lot.
Yes, listen and watch.
And I listened to Book 101 review on
Thank
Spotify.
you.
It's wonderful.
Thank you. Because they are supporting our videos. I think also Player FM, where podcast and video art goes together.
Excellent.
So, Miss Burnell, let's read lots of poetry.
Oh, I'd love to. I've got stacks. Don't threaten me with a good time. I've got many. My desk, you cannot see it. My desk is covered in just piles of poetry books.
Thank God, people, that I found Miss Sapha Burnell as my legit residence guest on Book 101 review.
And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much. So, Miss Burnell, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Sapha Burnell. That's Sapha Burnell. And you can visit me at saphaburnell.com and see where all of my books are sold. Basically, anywhere you go that has a greater distribution can bring my books in for you. And if you're somebody that's like, yeah, I would love to read all your books. I'd love to read Neon Leapin' and Usurper Kings and Char Nash and all of those books. But, money's a little tight. If you are in Canada, the United States, or a country that has an excellent library system, please do go to your local public library and ask for them to bring it in. The local public libraries are amazing resources, and I'm so proud of Canada and other countries that have good library systems for everything they do to not only support readers in their countries and in their local municipalities, but also support authors. So that is definitely a way to go about things. You can read my books in digital and in paperback and hardcover, basically anywhere in the world.
Yes, all over the world, worldwide, people. Yes, Miss Burnell saying that libraries in Canada are so great because all the books that I featured on Book 101, I borrowed in three libraries. Especially
Wonderful.
in yes, Vancouver Public Library,
Mhm.
which specifically, and Calgary, and here at uh, Maple Ridge. So,
Love it.
Miss Burnell, thank you for your time.
And thank you for yours. I hope you and everyone else has a fantastic day, fantastic week, and gets to read some really cool poetry.
Yes, tune in next week, people. We gonna read lots of poetry.
Yeah.
More to come, people. See you soon.